I'm David Haug, Superintendent of the Jefferson R-VII School District. Thank you for joining me in the third podcast and video for this series for our budget prep for next year. If you could forward this to anybody in our community that maybe doesn't have a copy of this, I'd appreciate it, as with all of the other podcasts, to keep our community informed of what's going on. And also, this is going to take a little bit of time today because there's so much going on with it, but I will start off pretty quickly here what the main point is and then just kind of move into everything else because there's a lot to cover. First of all, in the position that I'm in, I believe my job is to advocate as a public servant for our kids, for those that don't have a vote, those that can't speak. And I get concerned, if you go back to the first podcast, I talk about the future for our kids. You know, how are they going to afford a house? How are they going to afford a car, pay for college, or anything along those lines and not incur a ton of debt? And also just the federal debt they will incur. I really worry about our kids because they don't have a voice in that right now. And that's a big motivating factor for this, is that speaking on behalf of those that can't, we have great partners in that in a lot of different areas to move forward. I did want to take just a moment. Kind of having a background in football, there was a saying called "You are what your record says you are." I wanted to thank Senator Elaine Gannon for her entire career, starting as an educator, then moving into public service, as it currently is our senator. And thank you for taking care of kids and making sure that our voices are heard and looking out for our kids with everything you've done. You've truly had an impressive career, and I thank you for that. The second thing is, for those of you that are part of the Jefferson R-VII community, one of the individuals that really had an impact on this school district for many years was Mr. Glenn Keepy. And I remember Mr. Keepy coming to a board meeting in June of 2019 to address the board on the behalf of the community. And I remember his statement, and he said, "This community does not like surprises." And that, I not only agree with that, but it resonates with me. And I think about that statement a lot. And I've thought about this podcast a lot and how this message would come out to you, because at some point, I had to do a fair evaluation. And as I stated in previous podcasts, I think it was number 2, about the Ameren situation, I kept stating if all things were equal as far as Missouri school funding formula and the anticipated growth, that this district will be able to withstand the Ameren closure, no matter how that looks or plays out. This podcast addresses something more, and it's not something that would happen tomorrow, but in the coming years. And it's related to the Missouri legislation and some things on the floor right now that would have a dramatic impact, particularly with the Ameren closure. So I'm going to read this statement here. It says, if the Ameren Rush Island plant closes and through legislation this spring, personal property is reduced, along with our inability to recuperate funds from the Missouri state funding formula, the Jefferson R-VII School District stands to lose an estimated of $2.5 million from school budgets in the near future. On its own, the Ameren closure, I think we can withstand that. I don't know that we could withstand this, and I don't even know how that actually would look. But I think it's time we kind of look at that possibility as a community and see what we need to do to prepare for it at many different levels. I know myself and the Board of Education have already taken steps to do that. We've discussed those at some of our board meetings if you want to go back and reference those. But, kind of moving forward to this podcast, I don't like being disingenuous and crying wolf all the time. I do remember that story as a kid. And I hope all this breaks the right way and none of this is an issue in the future. I can tell you one thing, if the district has things go the right way, we'll have nothing to complain about. If the funding formula stays the same, or we're able to recoup funds from our local budgets, and we catch a break on Ameren and we still can maximize funds through that, whatever they have going on down there, whatever's decided through securitization. You also have the Boots of Unison plant, and you have the future James Hardy Industries and other growth. We'll have nothing to complain about. For the short term here over the next few years, what could be really tough on us is if there's a series of events. And I want to stress, I don't want to say that all these ideas are bad, and I'll kind of get to that in a minute. But I think there needs to be an honest discussion with a lot of different people about what's best, not only for our kids, but also making sure their futures are bright and we don't create issues for them moving forward. I always consider myself a problem solver, and I found this quote from Ronald Reagan that I really like. And I think that's the message I want to move forward, is that I don't want to stand and point fingers at people because I don't know that I understand all the issues that are going on. But I would like to see what I've seen the last couple months here at Jefferson is many great groups coming together to work together for kids and the community and the county. And I've seen a lot of great things. But Ronald Reagan stated, I believe a lot of trouble in this world would disappear if we were talking to each other instead of about each other. I think that's so critical when we talk about what kids, and to do that with humility. The main point I want to stress going forward is I encourage public servants, that includes school leaders, elected officials, state leaders, to come together to look at every option to benefit kids. That would include open enrollment and the effects of that on the state, vouchers, personal property. Some of these things, and I'll give some examples as we go through this, they kind of take a life form of their own and maybe they have unintended effects. But if we could come together to make sure we create a smooth path for our kids, I think is where we need to be as a state. The main point, my main concern is to look at all resources in the state for kids. Don't make decisions in a silo like this is the best thing that will fix this, but it has an unintended effect over here. Don't make decisions in a silo that cause other schools, I want to stress this, making one decision that cause other schools who are doing well to fail. We want to help all students, but we want to make sure nobody falls off because we're making changes. I'm going to make some assumptions in here because I believe that the decisions I'm making, I think people have the best interest of kids at their heart at any level. And I sometimes wonder about the decisions, but I'm not looking at their intent and saying they're trying to do any harm to kids or anything. And I want to be upfront about that and let everybody know when I look at this stuff, I see reasoning as to why they're trying to help things, but I don't want other things to kind of fall, and I've got some stuff I'll talk about later. Second thing is, this is really more to parents. I believe that you have the right to choose for your kids. I would love to have every student that resides in the Jefferson R-VII school district attend this school. But I also understand it's more important that the parent has the rights to take care of their kid. I want to be viewed as a partner and not that we know everything all the time. We have great resources here for kids, but parents have a right to choose public education, private education, and homeschool. I did want to talk about homeschool for a second because I'm going to talk about some virtual stuff down the road. When I reference homeschool, I'm talking about the true homeschool planning, that the families are actually engaging with that process, and we're not just going down the path of having a kid just do the virtual program, because I've seen a lot of concerns if the kid's at home only on the virtual and not engaged with the family. I hope you can respect that opinion. Don't ask you to agree with it. But those families that choose to homeschool and be really engaged with their families, I admire what you do. I admire anybody that takes an interest in their child's education. And I just want to get that out of the way. And also, too, to the Jefferson R-VII School District, we're somewhat insulated from this, what's going on maybe in other areas. I think number one is the enrollment, the day-to-day enrollment, when I'm talking about the number of kids in our district, has not really changed since COVID. That number has been very steady and stable. We've not seen an influx of kids leave our school district after COVID, as has been seen across the state in some areas. And actually, our day-to-day attendance is actually attending back to pre-COVID numbers. We were almost at 95% student attendance just before Christmas break. Which is really impressive. And I also know that we went 1-to-1 in 2013. We were really ahead of the game as far as virtual options for our kids. And that'll make sense as I kind of keep going here. I'm going to take a moment to regroup, and then I'm going to start the next part of this. So I want to change gears for just a second here and talk specifically about maybe some thoughts, perspectives from the education side. This is just comments and thoughts that I hear different individuals make in the business that I'm in, but also kind of talk about the impact of legislation and some historical information from other areas that have made changes. I think the first thing, talking specifically about the viewpoint, is that if you ever heard of the analogy about the boiling frog, if you boil water first and then throw the frog in, it reacts and tries to jump out. It's a very chaotic scene for the frog trying to survive. But if you take the water, put the frog in it, and then start boiling it, the frog doesn't really realize what's going on until it might be too late. And I think some of this legislation, as you begin to see it kind of keep changing and morphing over time, the effects it's having on education, and a lot of that's centered really on student attendance, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then quite honestly, probably the most controversial thing I'll say today is that I kind of feel like sometimes our state legislature, when you're just listening, okay, and I understand, I'm not down in the weeds and understand exactly what's going on. None of us really are in the business. We're kind of looking from the outside in. That sometimes our state legislature, it seems like the message is that public schools are no good. And that's a tough message to hear repeatedly over and over and over again. And I kind of liken it to like the St. Louis Rams. Like the Rams were kind of in charge of their own product, right? And in 2010, they knew they were going to LA. That's all been played out in court. And so what did they do? They decided to run their product in the ground and let their product get terrible, and then turn around and blame the fans for not coming and saying we need to leave because you're not showing up now. And I kind of see some similarities with what's going on in education, because you have the legislature and there's so many statutes and guidelines that come that guide our public schools. And really, the design of the public schools in Missouri was always the local boards being in charge of their districts. So that power is kind of left, and it's gone a lot to the state and even the federal government. So at some point in education, you're kind of like, okay, we're playing by the rules that are in front of us. The standards keep changing. The APR stuff keeps changing. And you're not really given a solid ground in which to kind of build from. And anytime you kind of get rolling with it, it kind of changes again. I know that's just part of being in education, but it does get a little frustrating. So as we kind of get pointed at as being failing, sort of the answer I'm seeing now is to move money out of the public sector into the private sector, whether it be charter schools or the privatization of schools. And to my thought, and I think I've got a little bit of standing here when I say this, if that's the case, if the solution is to have less oversight on the school that makes it better, why don't we just do that for all the schools and kind of cut out the middleman? If that process is what's better, allow us to use that, maybe empower the boards of education a little bit stronger. Because I can tell you this, I don't know how many people are aware, I know people in my community kind of know this that I speak with, but I started actually at a private school my first 4 years in education. And as a teacher, when I made the transition out of the private school setting into the public, I'll be honest, I was pretty embarrassed sitting in our first few staff meetings, specifically when we were talking about content. I finally had to grab a teacher and just say, hey, I am lost here. I don't even know what's going on, because really, when I was at the private school, I was handed the book, kind of told what would need to be done, had a lot of resources I could use, but really given the autonomy to be in the classroom. Didn't feel like there's a ton of oversight, and you come into the public sector, there's tons of oversight, And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but there's a lot of paperwork to it, and it can be a little bit laborious at times with, all the curriculum teaming and mapping you're doing, all the review of test results. It was just a whole different world. So if the answer is less oversight, let's make it so for all districts. I want to kind of shift a little bit to state legislation and kind of how things start and how they're ending up, and give us perspective. I've been in administration 20 years now. Specifically, I'm going back to our virtual program in Missouri. There used to be something called MoVIP, and I felt like it was kind of hard for kids to get into and who was going to pay for it. And it wasn't a real smooth process getting in. And just before COVID, a couple years before COVID, something called MoCap came out, which is our current provider. And to my recollection, the intent of that, which I didn't disagree with, having worked at small schools, I know that small high schools, rural high schools in Missouri, can't always provide the same course options, curriculum, particularly in grades 11 and 12, as say like large school counterparts that have different resources. And that was kind of the way it has been in Missouri for a long time. But then the Chromebooks came into play around, a lot of school districts shifted to Chromebooks around 2015. And suddenly, and this is where Jefferson, I think, was ahead of the game, is that we put a lot of courses online during that junior and senior year that really beefed up our curriculum, and a kid wasn't taking PE 2 or 3 times a day during their senior year, or having too many classes that really didn't challenge them. And so the original part of MoCap, as I jump back to that, was to help encourage small schools through legislation to make sure they're filling gaps and that they would be providing virtual courses that kids may not have access to. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think that's a good, healthy thing. I would tell you about a year into it, though, as a practitioner in education and a principal at the time, and meeting with area principals in our meetings, again, the intended effect was to help small school fill holes where kids were sitting in person, but they might come down to the library, do an online class, then go back to their normal schedule. The kids would stay in person but have access to those courses. What the principals noticed was suddenly there were pockets of kids at large school districts that were going full-time virtual at home, even though the school districts had a lot of those options for them there. So that was sort of this unintended consequence of MOCAP, was kids started to leave, go virtual for the full day. And again, this was just before COVID hit, and it's kind of a different world now. And really the regulations and guidelines, at first when MOCAP came out, the schools had a lot of say whether they felt like the student would have a great chance of being successful in a virtual class. They could deny it, the family could appeal. That's all gone now. Basically, the families just choose where they want to go. And that's why I differentiate between homeschool, where the family's truly engaged doing the curriculum, or having a kid at home on a virtual program full time. I am very concerned about that. I would like to see data from the state of kids that are in those online programs, and the things that I'm seeing as not only principal and superintendent now across the state is that kids are leaving the system, their public school system, and going into a virtual system. I don't think the scores are great. I also know that I think if kids struggle there, they aren't coming back to any sort of education. And if you really think about the burden that this state could be facing in a few years with a student population that's not being educated, that's catastrophic. That could take effect in 8 to 10 years. We could really see the true effects of that. So I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. I'm very concerned about the number of kids that may not be getting an education in Missouri, that may be sliding through the cracks for whatever reason. Whether you agree with how we do business at a public school, we've got to make sure our kids are getting an education, because the numbers are down across Missouri in public school, kids attending, but I know in our area, private school numbers are down. Where are the kids? Like I said earlier, parents are in charge of their kids' education. As long as they're getting the education they need, great. But I'm concerned about a group out there that is struggling to get an education right now because of kind of the system we've created. So that's the long and short of MOCAP. Another example is like kind of what concerns me about that frog boiling model of having to change legislation year to year and keep sort of just changing it. With Senate Bill 190 last year, I'm not going to talk about the content or question what was going on. It was related to personal property. The legislature decided that to provide relief for senior citizens on personal property, except it really wasn't dictated by the state how it was supposed to be done. It was very confusing language. It was actually placed back into the counties to make those decisions. And if you start looking at how this is being passed county to county, it's vastly different. It's very confusing to read. I know this spring they've come back, and I know there's been one round of vote on it to date to try to correct some of that language. But that's kind of how government is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be clean because the power is supposed to lie locally. And those are just examples that as things are decided at the state, what is the true impact that it's having on education? I'm going to give some examples of legislation that has other effects, and this is like pending open enrollment, voucher charter school, and personal property. I will own any information that's incorrect, and I welcome anybody to sit in here with me and offer critique or anything, because I like to have a better understanding of it. It's impossible for myself in a small school district, along with the staff that we have, to fully research this all the time. But I can tell you this, as you look at the history of open enrollment across the country, specifically to Iowa, one trend does happen. I think this state really has to ask the question, specifically on small schools. And I'm a small school district, and I believe small schools are great for the state, great for education. Do we have weaknesses? Absolutely. Do we know what our strengths are? Absolutely. But I believe it's a great environment for our kids. But I do know once you flip to open enrollment, it's really hard on small school districts. If you look at Iowa as an example, their small districts just almost disappeared and went to larger school districts within each county. And this is kind of alluding to the personal property stuff, that if we reduce personal property in Missouri without something to backfill it, the small schools are going to get kind of tattooed again as far as that goes. But in Iowa, there's like a 5.4 per $100,000 evaluation. That's for the real estate. That's every school district starts with that number. And then school districts, it appears to me from everything I'm reading online, they kind of go in individually and kind of cherry pick different taxes. It appeared that on the real estate tax in Iowa, it was running anywhere between 8% and 16% per school district, depending on their needs. If I'm wrong on that, I'll stand corrected and allow somebody to kind of correct me on that. But that's what I'm reading, and I've kind of heard some other advocates in Missouri talk about this. Voucher and charter schools, again, kind of selfishly, I mean, the rules are a little different for charter schools than they are than what we deal with. Number one is that, we're expected to have 100% of our staff certified. Number one on their list of what they've got to do for charter schools is only 80% of the staff need to be appropriately certificated. And that's a difference. And so my question is if that's what's good and that's where we're moving money to help offset deficiencies, allow us to kind of follow those same rules. I'm not advocating for going to 80%, but there is a difference between how the charter school functions and how public schools function. And then also the redirection of public funds to help privatize schools. Again, remember, we get about $2,000 a kid here at Jefferson, and those are in the prior podcast through the funding formula. We can't recuperate any of that. That system is so antiquated. But as I listen to professionals in the business and the world of school finance, it appears that if some of those charter schools pop up in certain districts, per kid, these schools will be reimbursed at $10,000 to $18,000 a kid. So that's a vast difference in what we receive here based on the Missouri school funding formula. Again, I'm not sure how that plays actually into privatized education as well. I do know charter schools are run like a business, and I do know I've seen this, not in the state of Missouri, but I have seen where a charter school operates, seen it firsthand, where a student is sitting there working on an online program with no certificated member in there. It's basically a teacher's aide monitoring their progress online. The person does not hold a certificate. Basically, the kid's being supervised in a virtual school. So I think there's a lot of questions when I look at charter schools. And again, if that's what's best for kids, let's make that an even playing field for everybody. I'm going to take just a moment here and shift gears again and close this out. So you'll see me in just a second. Thanks for being patient with me here. Of course, it probably seemed pretty seamless when Stevie gets done editing this. I want to take a moment as I close this out. Again, I remind you to share this with anybody. And I go back to our main concern at the Jefferson R-VII School District. And I think it's really great to bring people to the table to look at all avenues and resources possible. And I go back to Mr. Keepy's words. This community does not like surprises. And the combination of the Ameren closure, some state legislation that could be coming, could really put this district in peril when we can't get any state funds. And that's in the coming years. That's not for tomorrow. That's not for next year's budgeting. But we've got to have those honest conversations as a community. I wanted to get that word out there. I will also tell you that I believe I'm a problem solver, and but it's not just me. It's getting great people in the room to do this. I see this happening. I wanted to thank Representative Buckeye Courtway recently met with us back in December. Really I think if you look at that model where her group came in, met with us, met with the mental health side to look at the different resources we have in this county and trying to share some of those stories with the state of Missouri. It's been a very healthy process, and that's really what we need to be doing for our kids, is meeting to see what we can do for all the kids in Missouri together and not allow people to fail that shouldn't be failing, that haven't been failing because of the decision we're making, but those that are struggling, to definitely reach our hand out and help them is my goal. And again, I thank Representative Buckeye Courtway for opening that opportunity earlier in the school year. Just real quick, I know as a leadership strategy here at Jefferson, we look at servant leadership, and there's 10 terms. We focus on 3. That's first of all, listening. I know our administrative team really works on listening to our community and seeing what we can do to make it better if it's reasonable. The second thing is persuasion. Let's be honest, people in life don't want to be told what to do. But if you take time like I'm doing today to explain our point of view, I am happy to sit down with anybody and discuss what's great for kids and maybe have a better understanding of their point of view. And persuading individuals that this might be a better path is really part of servant leadership. And finally, the one that's most important to me is the commitment to the growth of others. Sometimes in business, in this business, we get a little bit jealous of others, and we want everybody to be successful, because ultimately our country's a better place, our state's a better place, our county's a better place, our communities are a better place. If our kids receive a great education, they're great people. I've yet to be to a school district where there were just bad kids. I have yet to see it. I've worked in a couple different, I've been at Jefferson at 13 years. Prior to that, I've been in a lot of different districts, kind of working that administrative chain up, food chain up, and teaching chain up. Every place I've been has great kids, and we need to make sure we remember that. So my last And I go back to the main point from the beginning. I encourage public servants, school leaders, elected officials, anybody that has a stake in this to come together. Let's look at all the resources we have and do what's right for our kids. Thank you.